Hello, Tanse, and welcome to APTN National News Weekend. I'm Daryl Stranger. A high-profile missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls advocate accused of faking her disappearance and her son's is likely to be spending at least the next several weeks in an Oregon jail. Dawn Walker had her first court appearance on charges relating to the abduction of her son. Advocates, family, and law enforcement searched for the Saskatoon woman and her 7-year-old son for a week. They were found last Friday in Oregon. Here's more from Leanne Sanders.
Dawn Walker is now facing U.S. charges related to her disappearance. The U.S. Attorney's Office in Oregon filed documents in court Monday. They state that Walker is a flight risk and that she should be kept in custody until her next appearance on September 7th. She was formally charged with knowingly producing a passport of another person and having ID which was stolen or produced illegally. If convicted on those charges, Walker could face several years in a U.S. jail. The documents also allege she faked her death and that of her son. Included in the evidence are lists found in notebooks allegedly made by Walker on how to disappear. Special Agent for the Department of Homeland Security, Clinton Lindsley, also states in an affidavit that when he told Walker during her arrest that people presumed she and her son had died in the river, Walker allegedly replied, "He doesn't want to be with his father." According to the documents, Walker and her son's father have been involved in a lengthy custody dispute. Her son was brought back to Saskatoon Saturday and returned to his father, Andrew Jansen. Saskatoon police said yesterday that Walker faces charges of parental abduction and mischief and expressed that more charges may be coming. Meanwhile, supporters of Walker have been holding walks and rallies bearing signs of "I stand with Dawn," and a GoFundMe campaign for Walker's legal defense has raised almost $17,000. Requests for an interview with the boy's father, Andrew Jansen, have been declined. Leanne Sanders, APTN National News, Saskatoon.
Over to Quebec now, where the Mohawk community of Kahnawake is at an impasse regarding the results of an independent forensic audit of pandemic spending. The new chief and council says there's proof of wrongdoing, while the former chief and council insists everything was done according to the rules. Lindsay Richardson explains.
It was in the height of the pandemic, the opening of an internation vaccination clinic on Kahnawake Mohawk territory. But in the fifth wave of the pandemic came an election, and with it, a change of hands over at Mohawk Council. The new team's campaign promise: investigate pandemic spending. Jeremy Tomlinson is a former Mohawk Council chief. He initiated an independent forensic audit of council spending of pandemic funds and says he was disturbed by the findings of the audit into the Emergency Response Unit, or ERU.
From there, I had conducted a preliminary examination of the financial situation related to the pandemic response.
APTN received a summary report presented to the community. According to the document, nearly 40% of the total amount allocated for salaries and hiring of casual help went to 3 people in management positions. A review of $1.4 million found 35% were paid personally by ERU members and reimbursed without formal expense reports. The auditing firm also noted that several journal entries were recorded to move expenses from one department to another, which, quote, appears to represent attempts at camouflaging or hiding the nature of such transactions. But some of those targeted in the audit are questioning the process and the choice to release only a portion of the findings to the community.
I mean, it stinks from beginning to end.
Former Kahnawake Grand Chief Serge Simon denies the allegation of wrongdoing. His signature is one of 8 on a rebuttal document issued by the now disbanded Emergency Response Unit, calling the audit a one-sided and self-serving, incomplete document that does not accurately portray the situation, insisting ERU members have done nothing wrong. According to the ERU, salaries and top-offs were signed off on by the federal government. They say transactions made off books or on personal credit cards were made only when buying products needed immediately, and that ERU staffers were only trying to keep up with a rapidly evolving situation.
They could have presented this in another way and let band members determine for themselves.
Indigenous Services Canada was aware of the Kahnawake allegations when contacted by APTN and say the department is taking appropriate actions. About approving top-ups and salaries, ISC clarified in an email that Council determines its employees' salary scales. Further complicating matters, ISC states Kahnawake was allocated over $5.1 million in pandemic funds, which is just over $300,000 more than the amount stated in the forensic audit. So what happens next? That's up to the authorities, who received a copy of the audit and a request to investigate. Quebec's provincial police force, the Sûreté du Québec, confirmed with APTN News that an investigation is underway, but would not comment further for confidentiality reasons. Lindsay Richardson, APTN National News, Montreal.
Who is truly Indigenous has become a contentious issue when it comes to hiring on university campuses. A few weeks ago, Queen's University endorsed a report on Indigenous verification, but a non-status First Nations community in Ontario is taking issue with the report. APTN's Fraser Needham explains.
Ardoch Algonquin First Nation lawyer Christopher Reed doesn't mince his words when talking about the First Peoples Group report, or FPG.
It's quite shocking, actually, that a university, let alone a university like Queen's, which wants to be seen as a great institution of higher learning, that they would, at the highest levels, receive a report that is almost comically filled with errors on the central facts.
The report was released last month and says the university should rely on local Indigenous communities to verify indigeneity of new hires. It used Ardoch as an example, saying, "The Ardoch First Nation Community Services Organization is a non-for-profit corporation with letters patent issued under the Ontario Corporations Act. The AFNSC would not be recognized under reference of Nations of Tribes in Royal Proclamation of 1763. Meaning Ardoch is not a recognized First Nation but a corporation." Reed says the only problem is the corporation the report refers to is long dormant and was never a governing council of Ardoch in the first place. He also says the FPG report ignores previous court decisions.
They also claim in their report that there's simply no such thing as a non-status First Nation, that only Indian Act bands can be First Nations, which is, again, even 30 years ago, that would have been a pretty far-fetched proposition. And we know now that the courts in the last 30 years have firmly rejected that idea.
Reed says Ardoch has no problem with Queen's moving away from Indigenous self-declaration to a system that includes verification checks, but by fully endorsing the report, the university is opening the door to problematic behavior.
In which people who are Indigenous but don't have membership in an Indian Act band are being challenged by vigilantes to produce proof of their indigeneity, which is really bizarre because having an Indian Act status card is not proof of Indigenous identity at all.
Ardoch has formally voiced its concerns with the report and asked Queen's to reject it. Reed says Ardoch is considering its legal options. Fraser Needham, APTN National News, Ottawa.
It's been 4 months since the Mohawk community of Kahnawake voted to exhume a buried priest. Earlier this week, it finally happened. The remains of Father Leo Lajoie were relocated to a Jesuit cemetery 65 kilometers north of his original resting place. Lajoie, a Jesuit priest, was buried on the grounds of the St. Francis Xavier Mission in Kahnawake in 1999. After numerous allegations of sexual abuse against him surfaced late last year, the Jesuits of Canada hired an independent firm to investigate. The results of that investigation were inconclusive, but the community voted in April to remove Lajoie's remains regardless. Some members feel the Kahnawake burial should have never been allowed.
We never agreed to have him buried here in the first place, in the first place. And then we had our Native women who were not allowed to be buried here because they married out. But they let the priest be buried here. They actually begged for him to be buried here, which wasn't right. And there was protesting at the time, but they did it anyways.
Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs continued their cross-Canada nation-to-nation tour with a stop in Winnipeg on Tuesday night. Dozens of supporters turned out to hear from Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs, matriarchs, and others. They're on a cross-country tour raising awareness and garnering support for their fight against the Coastal GasLink pipeline project. They've already visited communities in Ontario and Quebec. Those leading the tour say CGL is currently preparing to drill under the sacred Wet'suwet'en, also known as the Morris River.
My biggest worry is that once that pipeline goes through, we're not going to be able to drink that water anymore. It's going to be contaminated. Another thing we're so worried about is our fish.
All right, time for a short break, but still ahead, an Indigenous grassroots organization is raising awareness on what they call a potential international human rights crime. Welcome back. An Indigenous grassroots organization is raising awareness on what they call a potential international human rights crime. They're meeting with Northerners who live downstream of the oil sands. Our reporter Charlotte Moore-Jacobs explains their approach and the current situation in the watershed.
An Indigenous environmental nonprofit is sounding the alarm, opposing the dumping of treated tailings left over from oil sands production into the Athabasca River. Jessie Cardinal is from the Cree Métis community of Kikino in northern Alberta. As the executive director of Keepers of the Water, she's informing leaders at the Dene National Assembly on the protection of water downstream of the oil sands.
The Alberta government and the corporations are saying that it's safe to dump the tailings. We have a science team that is taking the corporation's information, their science information, reading it, understanding it, deciphering it to understand it's not safe. There's still saline, high levels of saline, and something called naphthenic acid.
It's what Cardinal considers mass misinformation to the public by industry and government.
Naphthenic acid is cancer-causing. It affects hormones in people and it affects hormones in animals. And so saline, any level of saline in fresh water, it's like salt. It's like putting salt in water. It raises the temperature of the water. Water has to be cold for fish to live in, and water has to be cold for it to remain fresh for us to drink it.
The potential treated tailings will flow through Dene territory before emptying into the Arctic Ocean. Daniel Tetzelli of the Dene Métis community of Fort Good Hope along the Decho is also sharing the message as the NWT outreach manager for Keepers of the Water.
We're downstream, so we're always affected by what happens to the water from these tailings ponds, but we have very, very little influence or opportunity to participate in any decision making about what happens around these tailings ponds. Most of the activity there is under provincial jurisdiction, so it's the government of Alberta, and they obviously are not going to come to us to see what we think or to discuss our rights.
Keepers of the Water also say Canada has not obtained the free, prior and informed consent of Indigenous Northerners, a legal requirement from the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples Act. Tetzelli says as the feds close in to release their formal discussion documents and draft regulations by the end of this year, the voice of opposition must get to Ottawa.
Assuming that these regulations get drafted and passed, the release of treated tailings could begin as early as 2025. So there is a few years, but the longer this process goes without people pushing back on it and getting their messages out there, the more difficult it's going to be to actually stop these regulations getting on the book and legalizing the release of these toxic tailings into the watershed.
Charlotte Moore-Jacobs, APTN National News, Willowday.
Southwestern Nova Scotia has one of the most lucrative lobster areas. A Migma Community has launched their food, social, and ceremonial lobster fishery using their own management plan and rejecting the plan from the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. As Angel Moore reports, the harvest is conflict-free on the water for now.
Cheyenne Francis dropped 5 lobster traps during the evening in St. Mary's Bay when the tide was high, the first day of the Sabaganagati First Nations food, social, and ceremonial fishery season. Frances is following her community's management plan and not the Department of Fisheries and Oceans.
You know, not just what my grandparents, my dad taught me, and, you know, this stuff that, you know, it's not just teaching them, but also, you know, the generations to come.
Each member of Sabaganagadie can catch up to 40 marketable lobsters per trap per day, and the catch must be reported according to the community plan. Earlier in the day, fisheries officers made their presence known. Frances says that is harassment.
When the non-natives are fishing, I don't see them sitting there at the wharves and boarding all their boats when they don't have permission to.
The catch is used for food, social, and ceremonial purposes and cannot be sold. Frances says her catch will provide a feast for a sweat and feed her crew and community members. Frances expects DFO officers will haul up her traps since she's not following their procedure, but she will keep on harvesting.
Put more out there. Like I said, you can't stop us. We're just going to keep going. Like, that's not in us.
More Migma fishers are expected to arrive here this week and launch their boats. Angel Moore, APTN National News, Saulnieville Wharf, Nova Scotia.
Time for one final break, but still to come, it was a gold medal day on the mat for Nunavut at the Canada Summer Games earlier this week. The housing structure in the Northwest Territories has been oppressing and dispossessing Indigenous land for generations. It's a complex problem that author Cattleya Lafferty tackles in her latest novel, This House Is Not a Home. Charlotte Moore-Jacobs has that story.
He had no other choice but to play by the rules of the game, to live in the confines of the government's regime. With the shutting of the door, he felt as though he had turned his back on the land that he truly called home.
Cattleya Lafferty is using her platform as an author to address the crisis that is Northern housing. The powerful prose titled This House Is Not a Home weaves a story of colonialism and the dispossession of Indigenous peoples in their own homeland.
As the co-chair of a committee for the Yellowknife Standing First Nation on housing, working there I really saw all of the issues that many housing residents were living through when it comes to having mold in their home or putting in maintenance orders that weren't filled, to having their house taken right out from underneath them.
The things that were supposed to be making their lives easier were instead filling their lives with idleness.
It's the third book from the acclaimed Dene, Cree, and Métis writer and inspired by true events.
A friend of mine, their whole family went out hunting in the early 80s, and they were gone for about 6 weeks in the fall, and when they returned, their house was completely gone, and they had no idea what happened to it, and soon found out that the Housing Corporation had assumed that it was abandoned and just tore it down with everything still inside of it, not caring, and then just built up a housing unit pretty much in the same spot and then expected them to live in housing and pay rent.
Ahead of the novel's official release date on September 1st, Lafferty is sharing the novel in Yellowknife at a book reading.
Really appreciate the leadership that you take on this front.
Sparking discussion from audience members about housing issues they face.
But if I choose to be in a relationship with someone and I have common law status, I will lose like half of my, I guess, rights or half of my property based on a housing situation.
It was the first time in their lives they had running water, flushing toilets, and electricity.
While the characters in the novel are forced to assimilate into the developing settler colonial mining town, Lafferty says it's also a story of empowerment, calling for land back, and illustrates how Indigenous communities honor who they are with resiliency, strengthening sovereignty.
Well, I definitely want it to be mainstream and and be picked up and recommended by different various organizations that have the ability to lift it up and bring it into the forefront of mainstream media so that people can know what's happening here in the North.
And the work is far from over. On August 13th at the Yellowknife Library, Lafferty will also be helping individuals impacted by housing issues in submitting claims to the National Housing Advocate. Charlotte Mort-Jacobs, APTN National News, Yellowknife.
It's an age-old tradition, preparing moose hide for leather. And as Sam Jones reports, it's being given a new life at a Winnipeg camp.
Our goal is to get him to relax and soften into a beautiful, beautiful soft leather.
That's Carl Fraze, the land-based education coordinator for Peguis Consultation and Special Projects, explaining the gratifying goal of moose hide tanning. Peguis First Nation is putting on this traditional moose hide tanning camp in Fort Gibraltar, a historic park in Winnipeg, as part of their land-based education program.
I really get a kick out of seeing the work in new hands, because my part is to provide the opportunity, and the learning and the teaching is between the animal and the hands. All these people are going to learn much more from their hands than they're going to learn from me talking about it.
With its location in the city, the camp offers urban, Indigenous, and non-Indigenous people alike the rare opportunity to stretch, skin, and smoke this difficult but rewarding material.
I'm kind of shy to get in front of everybody and try it.
Tanis Tom has been hunting moose since she was a little girl, but could never find someone to teach her this cultural art.
There's not really anybody in our area who does it that I know of, and we've always gone moose hunting since we were little, and me and my family, we want to try bring it back.
The more people who do it, it will bring back a valuable cultural art that once was entirely ubiquitous. There was nobody living here who didn't know how to tan a moose hide. It's an honor to those moose, and it's an honor to those people who have been doing this art in this place forever.
Sab Jonesa, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
It was a gold medal day on the mat for Nunavut at the Canada Summer Games earlier this week. Kahnawake Avalak from Cambridge Bay, Nunavut, brought home the gold in the 52-kilogram division. Here's the moment that was streaming in many Nunavut workplaces earlier this week, the moment he won gold. He's the one wearing yellow. Here's Avalak just after he won. Now this is a big deal for Nunavut. It is Nunavut's first ever gold in the Canada Games, and is only the second medal Nunavut has ever won at the Games. Avalak is 18 years old and was Nunavut's Male Athlete of the Year in 2020. And a big congratulations again to him and all of the other athletes at the Games. That's all we have for you for this weekend edition of APTN National News. I'm Daryl Stranger. Thank you for joining us. Miigwech, and have a great weekend.